where duty finally met truth. There comes a moment when responsibility and honesty collide, when the role you carry demands an answer the self can no longer avoid. This story begins at that collision point, where duty stopped asking for sacrifice and started demanding truth. This moment matters because leadership is often praised for endurance, not alignment. We reward those who carry expectations without complaint. But history remembers something else entirely: the rare leaders who pause long enough to ask whether the role they serve still reflects who they are becoming. For years, he had balanced carefully between obligation and conviction. Decisions were weighed, compromises calculated, appearances maintained. He fulfilled every expectation placed before him. And yet, beneath the precision of his leadership, a quiet dissonance grew. Not doubt about his purpose, but doubt about whether silence was still serving it. The fracture surfaced during a routine review of long-term national priorities. On paper, the vision was coherent, stable, impressive. But as he read through it, something felt absent. The language spoke fluently about growth, security, and continuity, but nowhere did it acknowledge the values that had once justified those goals. He asked for clarification. What principle, he asked, guides these priorities when conditions change? The room hesitated. Answers followed: technical, strategic, safe. None addressed the question. And in that hesitation, he recognized a truth he could no longer ignore. Duty had become procedural. Truth had become optional. And leadership, left unexamined, was drifting toward performance rather than purpose. That night, alone with the weight of the realization, he understood something fundamental. Duty without truth is obedience. Truth without duty is recklessness. Leadership demanded both. And for the first time, he knew he was approaching a decision that would force him to finally meet. Once the realization settled, it changed how he listened. Meetings that once felt productive now sounded rehearsed. Language designed to reassure began to feel evasive. The system functioned efficiently, yet it avoided the very questions that justified its existence. Duty was being fulfilled, but truth was being filtered. He began tracing where that separation had formed. Over time, he saw how clarity had been traded for consensus, how difficult truths were softened to preserve alignment, how honesty, once central to leadership, had become a risk to be managed rather than a responsibility to uphold. The conflict intensified when a policy review exposed this divide openly. A proposal advanced with unanimous support promised stability, but required ignoring an emerging reality that contradicted its assumptions. Advisors argued delay would create uncertainty. Others insisted acknowledgement would weaken confidence. The recommendation was clear: proceed and address the discrepancy later. He stopped the discussion, not with opposition, but with insistence. He asked that the contradiction be named, documented, and discussed openly. The room resisted. Some warned that transparency would invite criticism. Others argued that the issue was manageable, but none could explain why truth should wait. The turning point came when he articulated the cost of avoidance. Every decision built on partial truth, he said, accumulates debt, not financial, but moral, and that debt is always paid eventually, either through correction or collapse. Silence followed. In that silence, he saw recognition, not agreement yet, but awareness. The room understood the risk he was naming, even if it feared confronting it. The path ahead was becoming clear. Either leadership reclaimed truth as a foundation, or accepted responsibility for the consequences of delay. That evening, he drafted a directive unlike any before. It did not mandate outcomes. It mandated honesty. Policies would now include explicit acknowledgement of uncertainty, risk, and ethical trade-offs. No proposal would advance without articulating what it could not guarantee. The directive unsettled the institution immediately. Certainty had been replaced with accountability, and as resistance surfaced quietly, he knew the hardest part was still ahead, because asking leaders to tell the truth is one thing. Asking them to live with it, publicly, visibly, consistently, is something else entirely. The moment when duty finally met truth had begun, and it would not be brief. The directive changed the atmosphere overnight. Meetings slowed. Language sharpened. Proposals arrived heavier, burdened now with admissions that had once been avoided. Risks were named plainly. Uncertainty stood on the page instead of hiding between lines. For many, it felt destabilizing. For others, it felt overdue. The conflict surfaced quickly. Some advisors struggled to operate without the shield of optimism. They feared that acknowledging limits would invite criticism, weaken confidence, and expose leadership to attack. Others worried the new standard would paralyze decision-making. If every uncertainty had to be declared, how could authority remain decisive? He understood their fear. Truth complicates power, but he also understood its absence corrodes it. The real test arrived when a high-profile initiative stalled under the weight of its own honesty. The risks were too visible, the trade-offs too explicit. Momentum slowed as leaders hesitated to own consequences that could no longer be obscured. Critics seized the pause as evidence of weakness. Pressure mounted to soften the directive. He refused. Instead, he addressed the hesitation directly. Decisiveness, he said, was not the absence of doubt. It was a willingness to act with eyes open. Leadership did not promise certainty. It promised responsibility. And responsibility could not coexist with selective truth. The turning point came when a smaller initiative advanced under the new standard and succeeded. Not perfectly, but transparently. Challenges were anticipated, adjustments made early. When problems arose, they were addressed without denial. The public response surprised everyone. Trust did not fracture, it strengthened. People accepted imperfection when honesty accompanied it. What they rejected was surprise. What they feared was concealment. The realization spread quietly through the institution. Truth did not weaken authority. It stabilized it. Still, the cost was real. Leaders accustomed to comfort withdrew. Some positions changed hands. The culture resisted before it adapted. But gradually, alignment returned, not around certainty, but around integrity. He felt the strain personally. Carrying truth openly meant absorbing criticism without deflection, standing by decisions without illusion. It required courage not just to act, but to be seen acting without armor. And yet, in that exposure, something shifted. Duty no longer demanded silence. It demanded honesty. And as the institution recalibrated around that demand, the final question remained. Would truth endure when the stakes were highest? That answer would arrive soon. And it would decide whether this convergence of duty and truth was temporary or permanent. The highest stakes arrived without warning. A crisis emerged that demanded immediate response, decisive action, and public reassurance. In the past, leadership would have projected certainty first and managed consequences later. This time, the path was narrower, harder, and unmistakably clear. He chose truth. Not softened, not delayed, not hidden behind optimism. He addressed the nation with clarity about what was known, what was uncertain, and what risks lay ahead. He outlined the decision being taken, the reasons behind it, and the limits of what could be promised. There was no performance, only responsibility. The reaction was tense at first. Markets hesitated. Commentators questioned the approach. Critics warned that honesty would fuel fear. But something unexpected followed. People listened. They adjusted expectations. They prepared instead of panicking. Trust, once fragile, held. The climax did not arrive in applause. It arrived in resilience. The crisis unfolded with difficulty, but without shock. Adjustments were made openly, mistakes corrected quickly. Because truth had been present from the beginning, no revelation shattered confidence later. Authority remained intact, not because it claimed perfection, but because it never pretended to have it. The resolution settled gradually. The directive remained. The culture shifted permanently. Truth was no longer an interruption to duty. It was its foundation. Leaders learned that credibility earned through honesty outlasted confidence manufactured through silence. Standing alone afterward, he reflected on the cost. Speaking truth had invited scrutiny. It had narrowed his margins. It had required courage without applause. But it had also aligned leadership with reality, something far more durable than illusion. Duty and truth had finally met, not as rivals, as partners. And in that union, leadership found its most stable form, not flawless, not effortless, but real. Subscribe to join the journey, where